Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me today for this presentation as part of the GreyLearning Webinar Series. I'm Tim Grey. You might be familiar with me from the GreyLearning online video training course for photographers, or perhaps more commonly, my daily Ask Tim Grey email newsletter. I wanted to talk today about wide-angle photography, specifically improving your wide-angle photography, for two basic reasons. Number one, I really like wide-angle photography. I like capturing a wider view of many scenes that I might visit and photograph. And the second reason is that over the years I found that many photographers struggle with wide-angle photography. They have a tendency of making, I think, some of the same mistakes, and part of that is owing, I think, to a tendency to want to include too much in the frame. So I'm going to talk today about some of the tips that I've learned over the years, some of the techniques that I try to incorporate into my own wide-angle photography to help ensure that I'm getting great results, hopefully for every single capture. Before we dive in, I want to give a quick thank you to Tamron for sponsoring today's presentation. And I do recommend, so rumor has it that I may actually be featured in one of these videos at some point in the near future, but there's a series called One Location, One Lesson, One Lens. You can find it on the Tamron YouTube channel. So if you point your web browser to youtube.com/TamronVids, and then you can just look for the playlist for One Location, One Lesson, One Lens to take a look at that series. Some pretty cool stuff that's being covered there as far as photographers talking about how they're putting a lens to use to get some great results and have fun in the process. If you've been paying attention and tuning in to some of my webinars recently, you might remember about a year ago, there was a presentation that I gave on long lens tips and techniques. Today, we're going to kind of go to the opposite end of the extreme to the short lenses. If you'd like to catch a replay of that webinar presentation, it is still available. Just point your web browser to timgrey.me/webinar 170328. That's 2017, the month of March, and the 28th of March. And then you can view the replay of that. But the reason I really bring that up is because we're currently running a photo contest that focuses on using longer lenses, reaching out to draw in a somewhat more distant subject. And so if you're tuning in live or shortly after the live presentation, you still have time. The deadline to enter is May 25th, Friday, May 25th, 2018. And you can point your web browser to the address shown here, timgrey.me/contest1805, as in May of 2018. And perhaps one of the more exciting aspects of this particular contest in the GreyLearning Photo Contest series is that the grand prize is a brand new Tamron 70 to 210 millimeter lens. That's got a value of $799 US. There are some limitations, so be sure to check the details if you're interested in entering that contest. All right, so let's move past those long lenses and break out the short lenses and talk about wide-angle photography. And so first, what exactly constitutes wide-angle photography? At what point does a photo become a wide-angle shot versus a normal shot or a telephoto shot? Well, I'm sure everyone would have their own definition of what constitutes wide-angle photography. But as a general rule, I think it's safe to say that we can call anything of about a 35 millimeter or equivalent focal length a wide-angle shot. Sometimes I might push that up a little bit, maybe closer to 50 millimeters, but in general, it's those shorter focal length lenses. And speaking of shorter focal lengths, it's important to keep in mind the behavior of the camera. So generally, I try to simply talk about a 35 millimeter equivalent, meaning we're talking about a full-frame digital SLR when I make reference to focal lengths. And it just makes it easier, I think, to have a single reference that we're using so that I don't have to translate into a variety of different terminologies when it comes to that effective focal length. But do keep in mind that if you're using a camera with a smaller sensor, you might need to compensate for that. So, for example, somewhat typical, a very common lens would be something like a 24 to 70 millimeter lens that gives you a reasonable wide-end view at the shorter focal length and a little bit of reach at the longer range. And that is a nice walkabout lens. It's a nice lens for when you're wandering around a location and you're able to get reasonably close to your subjects. However, a 24 to 70 millimeter lens on a digital SLR that has a cropped sensor, let's assume a 1.6x cropped sensor, that 24 to 70 millimeter lens is going to have an equivalent focal length, as if you were shooting on a full frame sensor, of about 38 to 112 millimeters. So suddenly we've gone beyond the range of wide angle. So if you're using a quote-unquote wide angle focal length of 24 millimeters on a cropped sensor, you might be going outside the range of what really would constitute a wide angle shot. More to the point is that you're missing out on some of that field of view. You're not seeing as wide a view as you otherwise would. Fortunately, many lens manufacturers have started coming up with sometimes referred to as digital lenses, lenses with even shorter focal lengths so that we're able to essentially compensate for the cropped sensor. So here, for example, a 10 to 24 millimeter lens that would give you the equivalent on that same 1.6x cropped sensor of a starting point of 16 millimeters going all the way up to about 38 millimeters. So a 16 millimeter lens is generally considered a quite wide angle lens. It's not the widest you could go, but 16 millimeters is pretty wide. But again, on a cropped sensor, you're going to be cropping part of your image circle and therefore not getting that full field of view. And so if you enjoy wide angle photography and you have a camera that's got a cropped sensor, you might either consider getting a camera with a full frame sensor to make more use of your wide angle, or consider getting a lens that takes you down to that wider field of view. Just keep in mind that generally speaking, that means you would only be able to use that sort of specialty lens, that digital lens as it were, on a camera with a cropped sensor, although more on that a little bit later. All right, when it comes to actually capturing the image, I think one of the most important pieces of advice I could offer is to have a reason for going wide. Why did you put a wide-angle lens on the camera? And sometimes I find that photographers get caught up in particular techniques. I'll share an example of when I've done that myself shortly. But you get caught up, I want to make some wide-angle shots, or I want to use a telephoto lens, focused more on the equipment than on the scene. So here, I suppose this would be an example of a scene you don't necessarily need to photograph with any lens, but there's no reason to photograph this scene wide angle. Granted, the clouds are reasonably nice in the sky, but the foreground's not so interesting. There's just not much of interest going on in this photo. Maybe it was just a journalistic shot, or a test shot, probably in my case. So here, there was really just no reason to capture the image at all, let alone to capture a wide-angle view. So have a reason for going wide. So here, for example, with this lighthouse in Maine, a beautiful, let's see, would that be sunrise or sunset? That would be a sunrise, and just beautiful color, pretty nice clouds, obviously the lighthouse itself, and I wanted to include some of the rocks and water in the foreground, and so I made a conscious decision to shoot with a wide-angle lens. I could have zoomed in on just the lighthouse itself, or zoomed in on just some of the rocks in the water, or zoomed in only on the sunset, but I wanted to show more. I wanted to include more of this scene. You need to be careful about that, of course, to not go too far and include too wide a view when it's really not warranted, but more importantly, again, is just to have a reason that you want to photograph a scene with a wider view, with a wide-angle lens. Now, this shot, of course, looks reasonably normal, if I dare say so myself, and you might be familiar with an effect that is somewhat common with a wide-angle lens, and that is distortion. So you'll get perspective issues very often with a wide-angle lens because you're getting this distorted view, essentially. With a wide-angle lens, you're getting a wider field of view, and sometimes that might mean getting closer to the subject. So if I switched, in this case, this is in Piazza Navona in Rome, if I switched to a 70 to 200 millimeter lens and I wanted to photograph this church, I would need to back up a ways so that I could still include some or all of the church in my framing. With a wide-angle lens, I'm able to get that much closer, but it also means that because of my position relative to the scene, I'm very likely to get some distortion. Now, my attitude is, generally speaking, to embrace that distortion. I like that unique point of view. It's sort of like a bug's eye view of the world in some respects, where the distortion, I think, actually adds to the eye-catching element of the photo. It makes it more unique and interesting. And so I generally try to embrace. That said, sometimes I want to correct for that distortion. Fortunately, software these days makes that relatively easy with automatic profile-based correction for various lenses, as well as the ability to apply some rather sophisticated changes, transformations to the photo itself to get all those lines straightened up. But again, I think in many cases that unique view can make the viewer kind of get pulled into the photo a little more quickly, and they're just interested, wow, this is a unique view, because with our eyes, with the naked eye, we're not able to have this distorted view of the world. Of course, in order to get a good shot, not always, but more often than not, there are exceptions to be sure, but more often than not, I want to try to have a prominent foreground. So here I have this horse, well, a pair of horses really, but one that's nearly filling up the frame in the foreground, and then we have this context. So it's a portrait of a horse, but we also have some context, the white picket fence and the big tree and the red barn, so that we have some sense of exactly where we are, or at least a general idea, a general feeling of where we are. If the horses weren't here and I had taken a couple of steps forward so that the fence is no longer in the frame, then suddenly the photo becomes a lot less interesting, more than likely, because there's just nothing in that foreground that provides a prominent, obvious subject. There's sort of no key subject at that point. And bear in mind that with a wide-angle lens, anything that's in the distance is going to seem even more distant than it really is. And so having some form of prominent subject, and in many cases, again, thinking back to the motivation for capturing an image in the first place, or the motivation for using a wide-angle lens, with this image of some subway art in New York City, I wanted a photo of this little character, this bronze sculpture, but I also wanted to provide some context of where we were, some sort of sense. So anybody who's been to New York City and taken the subway might recognize the overhead sign in the background, or just kind of the overall feel of the room. But I filled the frame in the foreground with that key subject. And that is probably one of the most important tips when it comes to wide-angle photography, is to make sure that you've got something interesting in the foreground. So here, a prominent subject in the foreground. It doesn't have to always be that way, but it's certainly a good place to get started when it comes to wide-angle photography. That said, that foreground can also just be texture. And this is a tricky situation, I think, because I find that one of the mistakes photographers make most often, if I could identify a single compositional error that I see made the most frequently by photographers, I would say that it's using too wide a view when there's just too much. There's essentially a lot of clutter. The viewer doesn't know what the subject is. The viewer doesn't know what they're supposed to be focusing on. And so they're just scattered, meandering all over the photo. And so you don't want the photo to have this sense of a lack of purpose. That said, we don't always have to have a big key subject in the foreground to make a wide-angle photo that works. Sometimes the foreground can just be texture. In other words, sometimes I really do just want to show a wider view. This is a field of a canola crop on the rolling hills of the Palouse. The clouds in the sky looked reasonably good. We were getting some shadows going across the hills. And so it's really about the color and the texture and the hills. And so I wanted this very almost sort of exaggerated wide view to give you a better sense of just how expansive this field of canola really was. And similarly, here's another shot of a lone tree out in the Palouse with a wheat field in the foreground. The tree is made a little more diminutive by virtue of using a wide-angle lens. I could have zoomed in and really filled the frame, but I like having that foreground context and texture. So sometimes that foreground can simply be an interesting texture, maybe with some color, something that leads you into the scene, leads you toward your key subject. Here's another example from the Palouse, a very wide view of an abandoned farmhouse, great clouds in the sky, wheat in the foreground. The house is really the key subject, but the sky was so great and the wheat crop looked so nice around the house that I really wanted a wider view, and of course this gives me this sense of context. So, as I mentioned, generally speaking, I try to make sure that I have a foreground subject that's sort of filling the available space, as it were, but in other cases that foreground can just be texture. You just have to be careful that the texture really works, that it's either framing up the overall scene, that it's leading you into the scene, or that it's providing interest all by itself. Another variation on that would be to use what I call an anchor, meaning having something in one of the corners. This is very similar to having that foreground subject that's very prominent. It's just different in the sense that it's not quite as prominent. It just kind of gives you an entry point, a starting point for the photo. So here the rocks on the shore give you this entry point. It kind of catches your eye because it stands out. It's dark against a light background. It's down toward the bottom of the photo where we tend to get started when we're looking at an image. It's very eye-catching, so that brings us in. Then we have the water, that wave, the whitewash at the front of that wave that provides a little bit of a leading line that leads us back deeper into the photo, and then we kind of check out the boats and the beautiful color of the water and the backdrop, etc. But having that corner element. So you might say that this photo has a lot of sort of open space, but hopefully, my intent anyway, was that that open space provided some degree of interest all by itself. So having an anchor there is sort of along the same lines as that concept of a prominent foreground subject to help add interest to the image. Of course, in many cases, you might capture landscapes when it comes to wide-angle photography. And there, it's important, I think, to find the right balance, and we're all familiar. All of us know, of course, the rule of thirds, this notion that we don't want the horizon line, for example, to be right at the center of the frame. There are certainly plenty of situations where I would break that rule and put the horizon right at the center. But with wide-angle photography, more often than not, I want to have the horizon line, or the equivalent. If it's a city scene or something, there might be some other prominent line. I usually want it not centered, possibly at a third line, give or take. But one of the key things that I think it's important to keep in mind when it comes to the rule of thirds is that it's not really so much about an exact line at 1/3 in from the edge of the frame. It's more about having balance, and so that balance could differ from one shot to the next. So here, a beautiful sky just before sunrise in Sardinia in Italy, nice rugged mountains in the foreground, but this is really about the sky itself. Even if the mountains weren't there, I would have wanted to photograph this beautiful sky. And so I really emphasize the sky by having just a small amount of mountains down at the bottom. Similarly, with this photo, I thought these clouds were just so unique and dramatic looking that I wanted to capture a photo, but I also wanted a sense of context. And so with the hill in the foreground of a wheat field, just a little bit, just enough so that we have a sense of what type of place we are, with a real emphasis on the sky above. This one, New York City skyline, of course, a little bit closer to that rule of thirds, more or less. But again, not thinking about where is that 1/3 line, and instead thinking about which area of the scene is more important or more interesting, and that can be tricky. Here, for example, you're photographing the skyline of New York City. You would think that it's the skyline that is the most important element there, and that's fair. But the sky is quite interesting, and so here I would be thinking more. I've got the Hudson River in the foreground. Do I want more water or more sky? And the sky certainly looks, I think, a lot more interesting at this point. In this particular day, with the current conditions, that sky, the clouds, looked more interesting than the water. So I want just enough water for context, but including more sky. And so trying to find that right balance between, in this case, I'm using examples of sky versus foreground or the landscape, but obviously you could apply that same concept to other scenarios. So here, certainly the hills and the shadows are important, but the sky really looks pretty lovely with those clouds. So shifting that balance. In some cases, just a tiny little sliver. The clouds were looking really great right around sunset here. And so just including enough water so that you know we're at the beach somewhere and we've got these wonderful, beautiful clouds. Or sunrise out in the Palouse. Again, finding a balance that works based on the overall scene, your sort of key subject, so the red barn in this case, versus that context, the surrounding area. I also find that it can be very helpful to get close to a subject. And I have sort of just a basic example, obviously not an award-winning photo here, but just that provides a little insight into some of the thinking you might use when it comes to getting close. So here, I theoretically have gotten close. I filled the bottom portion of the frame with the Belize sign, and I've included some sky up above, some clouds up in the sky. but I can get even closer by using a wide-angle lens. As I get closer and closer, I need to expand my field of view by using a wider focal length lens. So shooting very wide and getting really close just gives us a different perspective. So here, trying to find the right angle where we can still read the word, but we're able to get that much closer and have a more unique perspective. And the same holds true for other scenarios. Here's some artwork in the West Village of New York City, and trying to include this I Heart New York text and wanting to have it be a little more prominent. So sort of like that prominent subject I was talking about earlier, getting close to that subject so that it's able to fill the frame and using that wide angle view to give us some interesting context. I also find that it can be really helpful to change your perspective. Obviously, with a wide angle lens, there's going to be an interesting perspective regardless. And so then trying to find ways to make that even more interesting. And one of the easier ways would be to get low. Of course, interesting can also be going up high. Maybe that's with a drone, or you hire a helicopter for the day, or whatever the case might be. Get a ladder or go up on a bell tower. But I do find, especially with wide-angle photography, that getting a lower vantage point can be really interesting. So here, just dropping down below street level in Rome, for example, at Castel San Angelo, and including the reflection in the river, in the Tiber River in the foreground. And so just trying to get this more interesting vantage point on the subject rather than just the street level shot. Or even something as simple as being at the beach and getting right down low to the sand. A good idea if you've got some form of protection for your camera from the water in this type of situation as that wave is quickly approaching. But getting just a more unique, I mentioned that sort of bug's eye perspective earlier, finding unique vantage points. And that's not to say that getting down low is the only option for that unique vantage point, but it certainly is one of the options that works, is getting down low, using that wide angle field of view to make the foreground that much more prominent and to make the background a little more diminutive so that it becomes just kind of a supporting cast member to the overall scene. Something of a variation on that, I guess these different perspectives, different angles that you might use to photograph, to view the scene that you're photographing, is to look up, to see what's up above you. Here's the Oculus in New York City, for example, near the World Trade Center, and it's a really remarkable building. The funny thing in this case is that from the outside, it's interesting to me, but it doesn't really excite me as a photographer. It's not a building that I feel like I really need to photograph from the outside. But then you go on the inside and it opens up a whole new world. And especially this is a view not looking exactly straight up, but somewhat nearly so. And then using a wide angle lens so that I'm able to include a lot more of that context. It creates this almost abstract image, I would say. And, a simpler example perhaps would just be looking up at a group of trees. So here's some palm trees and literally laying down on my back, looking straight up at the trees, trying to frame them up as best I can. Here, the opportunity to include the sun in the frame, which I'll talk about shortly, but just having a unique perspective. And anything that kind of is a unique viewpoint tends to be a little bit more eye-catching as well, where the viewer is drawn to the image and is, oh, wait, what's this? How did you do that? And in the case of looking up, having that wider view can really add to that effect, because even with the naked eye, you're not really so much going to have a field of view that is as wide as this. So you're not going to be able to take in quite as much of the scene all at once. You've got to pan your head around to take it all in. Similar example using fall colors. And even with buildings, of course, with buildings, we tend to want to get farther away and make sure that we're shooting the building head on to try to minimize distortion. But sometimes that distortion of being close can actually be really helpful. So here's the World Trade Center. And if you go to the side of the building, because of the shape of that building, it essentially forms this pyramid going straight up away from you, which can be kind of fun and which requires really a wide angle lens to get all of that context, to get the sense that it is indeed a building. I also find that it can be helpful. I talked about using a key prominent subject in the foreground, but sometimes the subject is less prominent and more just filling the frame. So this tends to be something that I'll think about, that I'll implement when it comes to context related to color or texture, where the scene all by itself, even if I'm using a wide field of view, the subject matter is interesting enough to grab your attention, and where that wide field of view can actually be helpful. So here, for example, this artwork once again, and just providing that color and that texture, but more of it than I would otherwise be able to capture. So, normally it's sort of funny. I started out, as many photographers did, shooting too wide too much of the time, trying to include too much in the frame. And so my tendency in a case like this might be to zoom in to show just one of these yellow cars, I presume a taxi, and one of the I Heart New York bits of text, just a really tight shot to minimize what's in the frame. But as I progressed as a photographer, I found that I increasingly enjoyed wide-angle photography, and as I improved my skills and was able to better frame up the scene, I was able to capture those wider fields of view without creating just a bunch of clutter. And sometimes, that clutter, or what seems like clutter, really is the subject. I don't need an individual prominent subject because the overall view is interesting. But when that overall view is interesting, I still try to think about distractions and what is going to take away from that key subject. So this is from a slightly elevated viewpoint, looking at a neighborhood in Busan, South Korea, and obviously a very colorful neighborhood. And I wanted to include a lot of that color, a lot of the scene, so that you get a better sense of just how colorful it was. If I zoom in on one building here, you see that that building is colorful, and maybe you can see a little bit of a neighboring building, but you're not getting a sense of just how colorful the overall neighborhood was. So I wanted a wider field of view for the scene. At the same time, though, I don't want to include too much. So if I included the hilltops and the sky and some of the streets in the foreground, or the balcony that I was standing on, now I start to compete with that overall scene. So filling the frame with the texture, the color, in this case both, that can work all by itself, where I don't need to include everything else. So it's this delicate balance of trying to decide what to include in the frame and what to not include in the frame, and considering, is this really a scene that calls for a wide-angle lens, or should I maybe use a different lens? So again, having a motivation, a reason for actually choosing to use a wider lens, a shorter focal length lens, to get a wider view of the scene. It can also be helpful. So here we're framing the scene. I'm going to sort of do the opposite, filling up the overall frame with this scene versus framing. So I can take some color, some texture, and fill up the frame. Even though I'm using a wider field of view, try to make sure that I'm really filling the scene with that particular texture or color. But then I might actually go in the other direction and instead try to make sure that I'm framing up the scene. So here at Horseshoe Bend, of course, we've got the bend in the river and the rock formations. The sky, not so interesting on this particular day. I would have loved to have a better bit of clouds, scattered, puffy, cumulus clouds in the sky, although the soft light certainly helped out in terms of overall contrast. But the point is that I wanted to include this overall scene without it starting to feel that it was sort of lost, that I didn't know what the subject was. Obviously, in this case, it's pretty straightforward, but including some of that rock in the foreground. So this is at a 16 millimeter effective focal length, getting really, really close to that 1,000-foot drop down to the Colorado River, and including enough of the foreground rocks so that it creates this kind of bookended framing of the overall scene. And in some cases, taking that concept a step further, seeking out or taking advantage of a circumstance where the actual environment, if you will, can help frame up your subject automatically. So here, a musician in Central Park in New York City, and we've got the Bethesda fountain in the background. This is Bethesda Terrace. We have these doorways, these archways, and oftentimes, because of the acoustics inside of this area, you have musicians or singers. And so using that framing of the doorway, the archway, and focusing on the subject, but exposing based on the exterior area so that we get this nice silhouette effect, But again, using that wider field of view, but framing up the scene within that view and having a reasonably prominent foreground subject. Obviously, the relative size here, adjusting distance to or from the subject, was really more about fitting the guitar player here inside of that frame. Now, for me personally, I have a tendency of enjoying narrow depth of field, and I enjoy wide-angle photography, and so I actually enjoy the opportunity to capture a relatively wide field of view combined with narrow depth of field. So I've got a couple of examples here, once again returning to some photos of that artwork from the subway in New York City. And here you see that the focus was on the penny that is part of that sculpture. But if you pay attention to the larger subject as part of this bronze sculpture, you'll see that it's a little bit out of focus because I'm using very narrow depth of field. This is with a 35mm lens at an aperture of f1.8, so very, very narrow depth of field. So we've got the background. What might have otherwise been a bit of clutter now just becomes context, but also the narrow depth of field is helping to sort of focus, I hope, your view on that penny that's part of the sculpture. In fact, I played around a little bit more and got a similar variation on a theme, I suppose. So again, narrow depth of field, focused on that penny, and just using the rest of the subject, the scene, for overall context. And to me, first and foremost, wide-angle photography has the potential to create a more unique perspective, an interesting way of looking at a scene. I think that adding narrow depth of field to that can further enhance that sense of just kind of this unique view of the world. Something that, we're not really able to experience with our normal vision. We need a photograph to kind of create that scene for us, both in terms of that a real effect of narrow depth of field, because our eyes are constantly adjusting focus. So as we shift our view around the scene, we're constantly compensating and refocusing on different parts of the image. So it essentially appears as though we have infinite depth of field because our focus is adjusting constantly. But then also that wider field of view, that wider perspective. And in this case, getting relatively close to the subject, again, with that, analogy of a sort of bug's eye view of the world on some level. And here again, combining that technique of a prominent foreground subject with a wide-angle view, but then also narrow depth of field, so that, to me, it just, again, makes for a little bit more interesting view on the scene, or on the subject, in this case, a single prominent subject. I think it's also worth keeping in mind that you can also get away with panoramas with a wide-angle view. Now, this shot that I'm showing you at the moment is not a panorama, as you might have guessed. It is a single image captured at an equivalent focal length of 16mm. So this is a very wide view. These are, of course, the Moai statues on Easter Island. There's a row of 15 of them at this particular site. And I wanted to create this sort of diminutive look for these statues. They're so imposing and kind of overpowering almost that I wanted to have this wider view. Plus, I wanted to be able to see all 15 of these statues all at once. The sky, fortunately, was reasonably cooperative, reasonably interesting sky. And so with a very wide field of view, I thought this image was interesting. I thought it worked well. But my concern, even at the time, was that it would be a little too diminutive. That, yes, it gives you this sort of sense of isolation and a little bit of mystery, as it were, because you can't quite see the details of these statues. Note also, by the way, that distortion that I referred to earlier. You can see that the statues at either end in particular are leaning inward quite significantly. At least they seem to be. They actually were not. But again, that wide-angle field of view gives us that perspective distortion, especially out toward the edges of our field of view, at the edge of the lens. So I thought this was interesting, but I thought they were too diminutive, or at least I was concerned about that risk. It's not that, one shot is necessarily better than the other. It's just that I, depending on my mood or how I was sharing photos, I might sometimes want to share this photo. I might also want that wide field of view where the statues weren't quite so tiny. And so what I did is moved much closer to the subjects, to these Moai statues, still using that 16mm lens equivalent, In this case, I'm using a 1.6 factor cropped sensor, so it's actually that 10 to 24 millimeter lens I mentioned earlier, set to its widest 10 millimeter, which gives me an effective focal length matching a 16 millimeter lens, or field of view, I should say, based on a 16 millimeter lens for a full frame camera. So I captured, in this case, it took 3 images. Now I know normally for a panoramic scene, that general rule of thumb is try to use a focal length of about 100 millimeters or more, getting a little further away from the subject if need be, so that you're minimizing distortion in the frame. But I thought it might be interesting to capture that same scene as a composite panorama using a wide-angle lens, but getting in the process much closer to the subject so that at the center of the frame, the subject is more prominent, and out toward the edges it becomes more diminutive. We're essentially exaggerating that distortion effect, because now it's not just distortion within a single shot with a wide-angle lens, it's also distortion that continues out beyond the normal field of view of that lens. In this case, it took 3 frames to capture this overall scene, and so 3 images captured at a 16 millimeter focal length and then assembled in post-processing into a single composite panorama. And as you see, maintaining that distortion, but this gives a more, I think, interesting view, a less diminutive view. It's not that, again, I necessarily like one over the other more or less. It's just that this is a very different perspective. And so even when you're shooting wide angle, you might consider getting a wider view, not just with the focal length of your lens, using a shorter focal length or a wider field of view lens, but also getting closer to that scene and capturing several images in a sequence to create a composite panorama. And then another technique, so I mentioned my own personal bias on some level in terms of what I think works versus doesn't work. I don't know that I necessarily think this next one works versus doesn't. It's just that I have this bias. It started way back in high school, a long time ago, when I first learned, quite by accident, what a sunburst or a starburst effect was, and more importantly, how you accomplish it. And so I find myself now including the sun in the frame very often with wide-angle photos. Well, let's not kid ourselves, with photos in general, but that includes wide-angle shots. And then for me personally, stopping down that lens to around f16 or f22 so that we're able to get that sunburst or starburst effect in the frame. I know some people consider that horribly cliche, and I consider it a cliche that I like to embrace. So it works for me. You could still accomplish the same basic perspective without the starburst effect just by not stopping down the lens. But including the sun in the frame can be actually quite interesting, I think, with a wide-angle field of view. It just adds this extra element of interest, I think. So here, a palm tree, obviously with a very wide-angle field of view, putting the trunk of the tree down into the corner, obviously nice clouds. But I really do think that having the sun in the frame makes for a more interesting photo. And in my defense, I know if any of you follow much of my photography or follow me on Instagram, you've probably noticed plenty of starbursts along the way. But in this particular photo, I think also those rays of the sunburst match, if you will, the texture of those palm fronds, which I think is kind of interesting also. Maybe I'm just trying to rationalize my use of that starburst effect. Here's a sunrise in the Palouse region of eastern Washington state. And again, obviously at sunrise, well, obviously I say, in some respects at sunrise you might be pointing away from the sun so that you're getting that wonderful light cast across the landscape as the sun's coming up over the horizon. But it also can obviously be very interesting to include the sun in the frame at sunrise, or more obviously, I suppose, sunset. Here's another sunrise shot out in the Palouse. And so planning ahead in this case, thankfully, to know where the sun was going to rise, getting out there really early. The sun was rising before 5 a.m. or right around 5 a.m. in this case at this time of year. And so planning out that shot, getting things set up, and in this case, an HDR intended to try to retain a bit of detail in the abandoned farmhouse that is sort of the key subject here, along with the sun itself. But again, point being is that with wide-angle photography, you have that potential. You've got a wider field of view. So as long as the sun's not too far away from the horizon or away from your key subject, you can potentially include that sun in the frame, and that can add certainly an element of interest in many cases. That said, You don't want to fall into a trap of forcing the sun in the frame. So I showed a couple of photos from Easter Island a few moments ago, and when we were visiting one of the locations where there's just a single Moai statue, I thought, oh, I have a wide-angle lens. I have a very wide-angle lens. Why don't I include the sun in the frame with this Moai statue? The problem is I thought of this sort of randomly. I didn't plan ahead, and so I didn't make sure that I was at a location where the sun would be high enough in the frame or low enough in the sky so that it would be interesting. So you see the result here. It just, I think to me, looks a little forced, meaning that I wouldn't have normally framed up the Moai quite like this. I would have probably gotten closer to it, still including maybe a lot of sky within the frame. The clouds are kind of interesting looking. But here I'm pushing the limits. So this is once again at a 16 millimeter effective focal length in terms of that field of view. And so I really almost need to tilt the camera up a little further to really include the sun, except then I'm missing too much of the Moai statue. So I need to tilt the camera down a little bit to include the statue, or maybe move closer to that statue to really make it a prominent foreground subject. But now I don't have the field of view to include the sun because the sun is just too high in the sky. So I could sit there and wait for a few hours until the sun got lower, or I could save that shot for something else. So just realizing in some cases, especially when you're limited in terms of how much time you can spend at a given location or what time of day you're able to be there, don't force the matter of including the sun in the frame. More try and take advantage of that opportunity when it arises, when that opportunity exists. Another key tip, and this is probably a good tip in general, and especially when you're including the sun in the frame, but I would say that it's especially important with a wide-angle lens just because there's a greater potential risk of problems, and that is to make sure that that front lens element is clean. If you've got dust spots, you can see all the scattered. Granted, there's the starburst effect, the rays of the sun, but there's also these highlights that are caused by dust spots on the front element of the lens, which in theory I could clean up. They're very distracting, I think. If we take a look at this photo of the Pantheon in Rome, up in the sky there, you'll see a variety. They almost look like smudges, like fingerprints almost on the front lens element. And that really was a matter of dust spots on the lens. I would like to pretend like I had intentionally added some dust so that I could show you something to avoid, but even I forget to follow my own rules sometimes, to follow my own advice, and I neglect to take a look at that front lens element. Maybe because, in this case, for example, I'm not shooting with the sun in the frame, so you wouldn't think it's a particularly high risk. But with a wide-angle lens, you've got a wide field of view. There's sort of always the potential of having a relatively direct light source, in this case artificial, or with the sun, or even reflected light off of maybe a shiny building, for example, where you have this unexpected bright light that's headed right toward the lens and will illuminate those dust spots and create some rather unpleasant artifacts. In this case, probably I could clean those up without too much effort. But here, I mean, I suppose I could. In theory, all those spots are, for the most part anyway, out in the open sky, but then I'm going to interfere with the rays of the sunburst. Much better to just make sure, especially when you're going to include the sun in the frame, and especially with a wide-angle lens, that that front lens element is nice and clean. And be sure to check it in between shots. I've shown some examples of different photos from the Palouse region of eastern Washington state, one of my favorite areas to visit, but also one of the dustier places that I visit. So even in between shots, checking to make sure that you haven't gotten any dust or other debris on that front lens element. It's also helpful, so I mentioned my affinity for sunburst effects, but to understand how many aperture blades your lenses include. And it would be interesting actually, well, interesting to me anyway, to know how many photographers even know how many blades are comprised for the aperture of any of their lenses, really. It's just not one of those little bits of information that we tend to keep track of, I think. But especially when it comes to including the sun in the frame or otherwise creating a starburst effect, when you want to stop down the lens, the number of aperture blades actually determines how many rays you'll see in the sunburst. With this particular shot, the lens aperture had 8 blades, and so there are 8 rays in the sunburst. but that's only true for even numbers of blades, that the number of blades equals the number of rays in your sunburst effect or starburst effect. If your lens has an odd number of aperture blades, then you'll get double the number of blades. So an even number, the number of rays equals the number of blades. If it's an odd number, then the number of rays is double the number of blades. So here, I'm using a lens that has 9 aperture blades. That's an odd number, of course, and so we double it. We get 18 rays in the sunburst. It's actually the primary reason why I took this lens on this particular trip. This was with, it happens to be a Tamron 15 to 30 millimeter wide-angle lens, and it has a 9-bladed aperture, and I had this notion of creating a sunrise at this location. And that was really my primary reason. I'm sure there are plenty of other reasons I could have come up with, but that was the reason I wanted to make sure that that lens was in my bag so that I could create this sort of more dramatic variation on a sunburst effect. If you're not as keen on sunburst or starburst effects as I am, then you might actually want to opt for a lens with an even number of blades so that if there is a sunburst, it's not quite as prominent. It's not as sparkly, you might say, based on the number of rays in the sunburst. I also periodically find that with a wide field of view, motion can be really interesting to add a motion blur. So here, just a quick panning blur in a little bit of a forested area. I've got some blue sky and the green foliage and the trunks of the trees here. And so just panning upward with a relatively long exposure, this happens to be just handheld panning as best I can, perfectly vertically. You see we get a little bit of that distortion of the wide-angle lens causing some curvature out toward the edges. But again, just taking a wide field of view, but adding a degree of motion. Here again, getting nice and close to some canola flowers. It was a really windy day out in the Palouse, and I thought this was a good opportunity to make lemonade out of lemons. And so putting the camera onto a tripod, fixing it in position in front of the canola field, and then waiting for a good blast of a gust of wind and capturing a slightly long exposure. Again, with a little bit of a wide field of view, I might have liked having clouds in the sky. I'm not sure. That might have actually competed with the foreground in this particular case. But in any event, a wide field of view combined with some motion, a longer exposure time. And in fact, if you're using a zoom lens, this one can be a little bit tricky to pull off. But here, these are, I believe they were phlox flowers, and just a nice little carpet of flowers with green foliage. And so I used a wide-angle zoom lens. So you may be familiar with a zoom blur, where you take a moderately long exposure, and during the exposure, maybe about a second, for example, during that exposure, you zoom the lens. You adjust the lens zoom so you get this kind of burst effect. In this case, it's a zoom lens with a wide field of view, wide-angle lens, and instead of zooming per se, what I did is I rotated the camera while holding the zoom dial, the zoom on the lens itself, so that as I'm turning the camera, keeping the lens fixed, the lens is still zooming because the camera and the ring on the lens, or the relative difference in motion, if you will, between those is what causes the zoom. And because I'm rotating the camera body, I get a rotation effect or a spinning effect. So I'm combining a rotation blur with a zoom blur to get this sort of spiral effect, which I think is, well, I hope it works reasonably well. I know that it's lots of fun to create these sorts of photos, trying to keep the overall assembly as stable as possible so that the area in the center of the frame remains fixed in terms of its relative position. And so we're really just emphasizing the rest of the scene with that spiral type of effect. So a fun one that is possible, a fun effect possible with a zoom lens in particular, and I find more often than not a wide-angle zoom works very nicely for that. And then sometimes just a long exposure. So this obviously is in Seattle at the Space Needle, and the clouds were moving reasonably quickly across the sky. And so I added a 10-stop neutral density filter. The actual exposure time was right about 30 seconds. And so enough time to let those clouds form a motion blur in the sky up above the Space Needle. And with this sort of wider field of view, this, the Space Needle becomes a little bit more diminutive, and we get this larger sense of context of that Space Needle reaching up into the sky. And another idea, another concept for those who are feeling a little bit more adventurous, taking that wide field of view underwater. So this is just one example of an effect that can work actually really nicely when it comes to underwater photography, is the reflections of what's down below in the water surface above you. So getting down below the surface and suddenly that texture. Well, if you think back to earlier in today's presentation, I talked about a wide field of view where that prominent subject in the foreground could really just be a texture. Well, this is essentially the same thing, just turned upside down. Because we have those reflections up above, now I'm taking that same basic concept and adding an element of interest just with that texture and color. And so here, fortunately, shallow water makes it a little bit easier, both in terms of executing the photo, but also getting this more dramatic effect. This water was, probably just about 2 or 3 feet deep at the most in this particular area. And so the surface of the water is very close to the foreground, that coral structure, what have you. And so we're able to get a lot more exaggerated sense of that texture. And then finally, so I talked earlier about using very wide lenses, compensating for the behavior of your camera if you're using a cropped sensor. And so using, for example, a 10 to 24 millimeter lens on a 1.6x factor cropped sensor so that you end up with the equivalent of 16 millimeters. And I mentioned that those lenses are really intended only for those cropped sensors because they're projecting a smaller image circle. But if you attach one of those very wide, super wide lenses onto a full frame camera, you're not filling your frame with the image circle, and therefore you end up with some blank space, essentially. But that can actually be quite interesting. So here's one example. This is by photographer Andre Costantini, who was kind enough to send me a couple of samples of this creative technique. So using a very wide angle lens, a 10 millimeter in this case, and you don't get full coverage on a full frame sensor with this lens until about 14 millimeters. And so you can actually stay down below that 14, go all the way down to 10. You're not getting that multiplier effect of the smaller sensor, and so you're getting an actual 10 millimeter field of view, but of course the image circle is not filling the frame, and so you end up with this really interesting kind of almost like a vignette type of effect on the left and right edges, obviously the edge of the frame at the top or the bottom, well, top and the bottom. So an interesting variation. I thought this was rather clever, a variation on a theme of going wide, using a lens designed for a crop sensor, but using it on a full frame sensor, so you get yet another variation on a theme, an interesting variation on a theme in terms of that wide angle photography. So we've got a few questions here. First off, thank you everybody for joining me today for the presentation. I do have a few questions that we'll address here. So Scott asks about foreground anchor and what f-stop and focusing point. And it's interesting, with a wide angle lens, of course, you're getting a lot more field of view and you're getting a lot more depth of field by default. And so, meaning if you stop down, you're getting greater depth of field as opposed to using a longer lens. And so we can actually get really close. You want to try and pay attention to hyperfocal distance if possible, not because it's some sort of magical formula, but because it gives you a sense of how close you can get to your subject and still have the entirety of the scene in focus. So if you recall the photo of a tree out in the Palouse with wheat in the foreground, I made a point of staying, at the time I believe it was about 3 or 4 feet away from that wheat in the foreground, so that I could have that plus everything off in the distance in focus. As a general rule with a wide angle lens, I will tend to, if I'm trying to include everything in focus, of course, I will tend to stop down somewhat significantly. But it's another great example of the value of having a depth of field calculator. On your smartphone, for example, or using a depth of field preview, you can get a sense of how much depth of field you'll have. It depends on how close to the subject you're focusing. And so with wide angle photography, if you've got something relatively close, I would tend to focus on that subject, but then paying attention. There's the rule of thumb with hyperfocal distance that you focus a third of the way into the frame. That depends on how close that subject is. And so I would have a tendency to focus on your key subject, and stop down the lens so that you're able to get greater depth of field. But again, that depth of field calculator can be just absolutely invaluable when it comes to creating a field of view that has greater field of view and greater depth of field as well. All right, Jennifer asks about holding the camera, vertical or horizontal. That actually is a great tip that I should have included as part of this overall presentation, is to not forget about vertical. I think most photographers, probably myself included, tend to think about horizontal compositions when it comes to wide-angle photography, but don't forget that you can shoot vertically. I showed a handful of examples of vertical wide-angle shots. Don't forget that that is an option. Really, coming back to the beginning of today's presentation, I talked about having some degree of motivation for using that lens in the first place. You also want to have motivation for how you're framing up the scene. And for me, with wide angle, it's usually about what's interesting, what's compelling. I mean, I suppose this is true for just about any photography, but what's especially compelling about this scene? Is it the sky? Is it the water in the foreground? Is it something else altogether? And how do I emphasize that versus emphasizing some other part of the frame? Or, again, wide angle is not the right answer in every situation. So sometimes maybe you take a look at the wide field of view and say, nah, I need a longer lens. I need to tighten up this shot just a little bit. Stephen asks a great question about shooting directly into the sun. And I would say that, especially with a wide-angle lens, the risk there is minimal. And as long as you're not capturing very long exposures or using live view for extended periods of time, the risk is relatively minimal. If you're getting serious about including the sun in the frame, photographing the sun specifically, then I would definitely get a solar filter. It stops a tremendous amount of light, so the exposure can be a little bit challenging in that respect. But especially if you're using a longer focal length lens, if the sensor is going to be active for an extended period of time, there is a degree of risk there. But if it's wide angle and if it's for relatively short durations, then that risk is pretty minimal. I can tell you, obviously, you maybe have gathered, I shoot a lot of photos with the sun in the frame, especially wide angle, and I've never had any issues with damage to the sensor as a result of that. So a great question here about what focal length is the best compromise when it comes to distortion, especially if you don't want a zoom lens. And so, you ask specifically 16 millimeter, if you're going to get a prime lens, and that's a tricky one. I do happen to be a fan of zoom lenses because I suppose I can't make up my mind, and I want to be able to change my mind on the fly. But if you're going to opt for a prime lens, it is tricky because with a wider field of view comes a greater risk of distortion, as we talked about earlier. So part of me feels that, hey, if you're going wide angle, let's get a 16 millimeter or equivalent so you really have wide angle. But if you're looking for a compromise that doesn't have too much in the way of distortion, then I would favor a 24 millimeter effective focal length. It gives you a good field of view, still reasonably wide, but with much less of that distortion in terms of perspective and even just the lens itself. All right, let's see. The web address. So for those of you that missed it, let me get back to that first slide with the website address, the link to the presentation about long lens tips and techniques. You can get back to that long lens tips and techniques webinar presentation. It's actually on the Tim Gray TV channel on YouTube. So please subscribe to make sure that you get notification, or to increase the odds of getting notification when we add new videos there. We will have a replay of this webinar available as well, so if you've signed up, you'll get an email with that. And don't forget, by the way, so there's the address for the webinar recording for that long lens tips and techniques, the, I suppose, polar opposite of today's presentation on wide-angle photography. And then if you're catching this before May 25th, if you're live with me now, or if you're watching the recording before May 25th, 2018, there is the address for that photo contest as well. So that one taking a closer look as opposed to today's discussion of wide-angle photography. All right, so one more quick question I see here. And Richard asked about wide-angle portraits. As a general rule, you've got to be especially careful of portraits when it comes to wide-angle lenses. I'm not much of a portrait photographer myself, and so if I do include people in the frame, it's usually including them, sort of full body as opposed to a headshot. If you're going to photograph people, as a general rule, if it's a headshot, you do not want to use a wide-angle lens. Or if you want to create a funny effect or a not so flattering effect potentially, then you might favor the use of a wide-angle lens. But with portraits, you're going to get a nose that's very exaggerated and bulbous, and the shape of the face will get distorted. So for people photography where you're including their face sort of full frame, I would say probably not a wide angle in most cases. That said, the effect can certainly be very interesting in some cases, and often comedic as well, so that could work nicely in some cases. But otherwise, when I'm including people in the frame, I generally will have them sort of full body or half body, sort of like the musician we saw in Central Park earlier, where I'm getting a little bit further away so that I don't have just their head. I've got more of an environmental portrait, you might say, and there, that wide-angle effect can work really nicely. All right, well, thank you all very much once again for joining me for today's presentation as part of the GreyLearning Webinar Series. And thanks as well to Tamron for sponsoring today's presentation, making it possible, and also for sponsoring this month's GreyLearning Photo Contest with that grand prize of a 70 to 210 millimeter lens, a great lens, a great range. Obviously not the wide-angle lenses we were talking about today, but a wonderful lens nevertheless. In the meantime, thanks very much, and I'll hope to see all of you on a future webinar presentation as part of the GreyLearning Webinar Series. Thanks very much.